Welcome everybody to our afternoon session on neuroscience, which is exciting. I'm Pat Fitzgerald-Bocarsly, and I'm the moderator for today. So the first speaker is Cahleen Shrier.
Good morning, everybody. Amanda Bledy was going to be presenting this today with me, and she was not able to, and so I will be doing it all on my own. So basically what we're looking at are mirror neurons and the impairment that occurs in autism. And usually these are associated with interactions with people in sociological interactions and with friends and friendships. And so if they have this difficulty with relationships, does this affect the relationship with God, more of a vertical relationship then? So Jacober in her book talks about a woman named Anne who was diagnosed with autism. And when I say autism here, I'm talking about Autism Spectrum Disorder. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And Anne was nonverbal. She had difficulty with communicating with relatives and with others around her. And this really isolated her from the others around her, as you could imagine. Now, usually in general in society, when we see people like this, we tend to think that they wouldn't have a spiritual experience. They wouldn't have a relationship with God. They wouldn't understand that. Maybe it was somebody even just a different kind of disability. Sometimes we think about that also. So we wanted to explore this a little bit more and what did that mean? So first of all, I want to look at Autism Spectrum Disorder. And it used to encompass several different diagnoses like pervasive developmental disorder and autism. And now they put it into Autism Spectrum Disorder as of the DSM-5, which is a diagnostic and statistical manual that is used. And that came out about 2014. So there is a vast span of people within this. And I know I'm kind of generalizing. I'm really just taking a subpopulation. Not everyone is going to have difficulty with relationships, but we understand that that's where I'm coming from and when I say autism in this. So there's about 3.5 million Americans that are on the autism spectrum disorder, and it's about 1 in 59 children in the United States. And there was a 15% increase between 2016 and 2018. Now, why was that an increase? Was it just because we were more aware of it? Was there something in our environment that was causing this? Just really not sure. So at least a third of these people diagnosed with it will have some sort of difficulty with their speech and being able to communicate with their speech. Now, the cause is really unknown about autism, and it seems to be genetic and environmental, but they still haven't really found any causation at this point in time. And there's no known cure, and I have that in quotes there because it's not a disease. So they're not really looking for a disease, for a cure, because that's what you find for disease. So you'll hear when there's no cure. There is a group in Seattle, Washington that has been very successful in diagnosing children very young as an infant, and then being able to do different training, behavioral things with them and pulling them off of the spectrum. So they'll say there's no cure, but I'm not going to go into that here as much. So basically, it's characterized by a long-term disability, lifelong disability and developmental disabilities and difficulties that are occurring. And a main, usually key characteristic is affecting one's social behavior and interacting with others. So again, it's on, when you're talking about the autism spectrum disorder, then there's a wide variety of people categorized within that with different levels of mental ability, physical ability, and they're going to have various speech conditions and sensory issues. They may be sensitive to light or sound. It might just overwhelm their nervous system. Sometimes clothing on their skin, they don't like that, or they have to have very soft clothing. So the sensory issues are definitely usually related into this ASD. And so again, as I said, on a spectrum, some will be able to live independently, some will require support throughout their lives. Now, the autism ribbon that they use is a puzzle because there's so much complexity and so many different things coming into it that it's hard just to say this is what one person has that's on the spectrum. So there's another characteristic that somebody diagnosed with ASD might have is repetitive behaviors. These are self-soothing behaviors, and sometimes they're called stimming, where they self-stimulate. It might be like hand flapping. Maybe they're rubbing circles on their skin, just something they do repetitively that tends to help them calm down then in calm their nervous system. So again, you're going to have some that are verbal and some that are nonverbal. Often eye contact, they don't look at you directly in the eyes. They might be looking out and around or down at the ground. Again, we know there's some cultural context with that, as far as in certain cultures, if you're talking to an authority, you are to look at the ground and not to look up. So, but we're talking more about in this culture here. And again, like I said, there's going to be some deficits with interacting socially and emotionally with others around them. And therefore, that's going to make it difficult to develop and maintain relationships. So there seems to be, on the ASD spectrum then, it tends to be this triad of impairments. You have the social communication area, the social interaction area, and which John Swinton talks about is the social imagination area. And where these all overlap, that's where you tend to find the patients that are diagnosed with the autism spectrum disorder. So John Swinton, which was referred to last night by Hans, and he is one of the top theologians in disability of theology, or theology disability. And he added to the triad this social imagination, being able to predict what the other person is thinking or what the other person is feeling. So they're not going to be able to understand that. So if I had a sad face and I'm crying, you might think that I'm sad. And so you would come over and you would almost immediately, instead of having happy smiley face, would come over and you would start mimicking my behavior, my look, to kind of bring in empathy to that situation. So they also don't always understand how their behavior is going to impact somebody else. And so they can't work through that mentally. So again, this triad of impairments then is going to characterize the elements of relationship, and they're going to have difficulty with this. And again, this is more of a subset. This isn't not everybody on the spectrum. And so this triad really, and the socialization issue, has to do with something called theory of mind. And with theory of mind, and again, we have John Swinton here, and he's in Aberdeen, Scotland, at the University of Aberdeen. And we're just going to quote him here. And it says, "It is argued that people with autism don't have theory of mind and therefore find communication and relationships difficult because they don't know what is going on within the mind of the other and can't anticipate in the ways necessary for good communication and effective relationship." Now, theory of mind has been linked to mirror neurons in the brain. And there's this whole mirror neuron system. And it was first discovered with Rizzolatti and his lab. And these are specific motor neurons that have to do with the vision and the motor units. And so we have the visuomotor neurons then. So what's very interesting about this is like I'm watching the Olympics. And if I could do all those topsy-turvy twists and stuff on the balance beam in the Olympics, then my neurons would fire to allow me to do that. Now, just watching the others do that, all my neurons fire as if I'm doing those spins and twists on the balance beam. But of course, my body isn't actually carrying that out. And that's called the mirror neurons, or what we call the monkey see, monkey do. So the areas of these mirror neurons are in the inferior prefrontal lobe and in the superior temporal sulcus here. So we have these areas where the mirror neurons on. And we also find with autism spectrum disorder that there's a thinning of the brain in these areas also. So when tends to be this dysfunction in the mirror neuron system, then there's disordered social cognition, and that causes a difficulty with relationships and difficulty with empathizing. So, like I said, if I was sad and you were all happy, you would come in, but you would start bringing down your body language. Your face wouldn't be smiling as much. You would become more somber as you start matching my behavior. And often this is very difficult for people who have difficulty with their mirror neuron system. They can't anticipate what is going on in the other person's body and mind. So malfunction of these areas may prevent them not only from being able to understand me, but being able to understand their own emotional states. So they may not understand themselves if they're angry or sad or anxious or whatever. So if people with autism have a dysfunction in the motor neuron system and a decreased ability to engage in social relationships and empathy, does this also interfere with their ability to have a relationship with God, that vertical relationship then? This is Adam Brock. His father, Brian Brock, is another theologian in the area of disability, and he and John Swinton are some of the top theologians in this area. And his son has Down syndrome and autism, and here he is at his confirmation. So disability theology, what it's trying to do is give a broader understanding of the world around us and what it means to be human. And what does it mean to be human as a person has a disability, for instance? It also sheds light on what the gospel messages say about those with disabilities, and it gives voice to a topic that little theological light has been shed on in the past. Again, last night we heard Hans refer to it quite a bit. So here at his confirmation, we see Adam, and his father, Brian, who's the theologian, just felt like the Spirit of God was there and that something was going on in his son who has autism and Down syndrome, and he's nonverbal, so he really couldn't explain it. But he really felt like during the confirmation that God was connecting with his son Adam at this point. So we see in Cox's paper, we see that she says that it does not mean that spirituality cannot be present in all of us, including those with autism. So in the studies that she's been finding, that's the conclusion she came up with. Lamar Hardwick now is a pastor with autism, and he defines himself as this and will put up videos about him and being a pastor and how difficult it can be, like being around people at church on Sunday and having to minister to them and what that does to his nervous system and needing time to calm down afterwards. But he comes up with, and his conclusion is, believes that every individual is created in the image of God. If they are, then they must be able to have a spiritual connection with the Creator. We also see in Ekblad's paper, and this is a secular paper, that those with autism may have a higher spiritual factor in belief in the supernatural and paranormal. Now, this is broader than just having a relationship with God. Again, this is a secular paper. So if they can have a relationship with God, then we would need to say that, and there's some difficulty in their mirror neuron system, we'd have to say that that mirror neuron system and that theory of mind is not necessary to have a relationship with God then. Another woman, Patricia Powell, was diagnosed later on with autism, and it just totally changed her perspective of who she was and her self-worth and the way that God had created her. And here's a quote from her. It says, "I no longer think negatively when it comes to the struggles I've had. Instead, I've learned to embrace God's craftsmanship, even when I have moments of sensory overload. I believe that God creates each person the way they are for a reason. He doesn't make mistakes." And a book with a collection, William Stillman, a collection of stories by parents and children that have autism. He talks about, here's one story where Michael discusses his experience with the spiritual connection between God and autism. Was often met with a direct access to God who gives answers to the chaotic world of which the person with ASD is trying to make sense. So Anne, we talked about in the beginning, she later was given a speaker board to help her speak and communicate with others. And she told over the years, she started telling how she had these conversations and communicating with God during that time that she couldn't communicate with others. So what she lacked in communication with people around her was mended with the depth of her relationship with the Holy Spirit and was evident from her deep understanding of the faith. So we saw that the Autism Spectrum Disorder has a triad of impairments, that there seems to be a dysfunction of the mirror neurons that's associated with this, and that this hinders the human relationships. However, in spite of that, God seems to transcend all of that and still communicates with these people and has a close relationship with them. Thank you. Any questions?
I have a question. Is there any direct evidence other than a sense that somebody is having a spiritual connection? I mean, what's the evidence?
Well, the evidence was on the people themselves that could somehow communicate either with the speaker board or other, verbally, if they were verbal, to be able to do that. Now, in Adam's sense, he does not have a speaker board, and he did not have, was not able to communicate that verbally. So that was a sense that his father was having. So it was an assumption that was made in that case.
Okay. What is a speaker board?
It's kind of like an iPad, and they have different, and I haven't seen it exactly, but there's either different symbols or something that helps them to communicate. So it speaks for them. It gives them a voice by them punching in certain things into the board.
Often it's pictures, right?
I think it's pictures.
Yeah. What about people that are completely nonverbal?
Well, we saw that with Anne in the very beginning. Nobody had any idea that she'd had any experience with God. It wasn't until she got that speaker board that she was able then to communicate that to others. So apparently you don't have to be verbal to communicate with God. It's just that we would not be aware of that.
Yeah, my question is, does autism maybe give us some idea of what distinguishes us from the animals, what makes us humans different from animals? Or could it have something to do with our evolutionary history? Might some of our ancestors have, the characteristics of autistic people, or might there be animals that have these deficiencies? Obviously, there may be animals that have, that really can't communicate with humans. So I just wonder if this might have broader implications with regard to what makes us human.
Right.
From other animals or even our ancient ancestors, our prehistoric ancestors.
Well, a spectrum is pretty broad.
Yeah.
I think we're all on the spectrum. And I know there's a way to diagnose and not diagnose, but I think we all have, or probably all of society could be put on a spectrum. So then you have more of a continuum. And so whether animals have autism, I'm not really sure. I haven't just studied that. I know there can be like Down syndrome in animals and things like that. So I'm just not really sure. Somebody else may have studied it here and could speak to that.
Some of my colleagues are looking at animal models of autism, and they measure certain behaviors that are unusual in mice, for example.
I know, like with chimpanzees, they've looked at the repetitive behaviors and the cerebellum and stuff like that, but I don't know actually about relationships and stuff like that. But my guess would there be something that goes on like that with animals and trying to be part of the group and not being part of the group, and whether they're going to survive or not, then that would probably play a big role. If you're a herd type of animal and you're out on your own, you may not survive as well, would be my guess. But I'm just totally guessing here, and this is not my area. But I think it's an interesting question.
So does anyone find a correlation between ASD and the charismatic gifts?
I have not looked for that specifically, so I'm not really sure. Good question, though.
Interesting question. All right. Thank you very much for a really fascinating talk.